Shalom. All praises to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem, Rakah, Kodash. Double honors to my apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Shalom to my brothers teaching His word. This is Revelation 13, verse 16. And He calls of all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. This is a vital prophecy, an important warning, that Yahweh Shemashai gave us the insight to tell his sheep, because the scriptures mention that the Lord has set up watchmen, and ultimately they're going to warn from the Lord, because at the end of the day, this is really the Lord's chip. This is really the Lord's test, because the mark of the beast, which is the RFID microchip or the NFC microchip, is going to be a huge test, the trial of your faith. If you're really for Yahweh Shemashai, or if you're not. And we're going to see who's really down for Yahweh Shemashai. And we hope that the Lord keep us in that time, like it mentions in the book of Revelation 3 verse 10, that the Lord's going to keep those that persevered, those that endured to the end, which is the elect, from the hour of temptation, meaning the hour of trial, when this chip is going to be made mandatory. And ultimately, it's going to be made mandated by the governments. And all these governments, particularly in the West, are all controlled by the elites of Edom, the Rothschilds and these different, elite families. And the Rothschilds being the number one, because they're like the major, family, of the elite dynasty of Edom, and all of these Edomites, the elites of them, have a God complex. They think that they're on par with the Most High. They even think they can even overcome the Most High. That's how insane that they are. But the Lord said in the scriptures said ultimately that the deceiver and the deceiver are His. So Yahweh Shemashai controls everything, even including this devil. So ultimately, this is really the Lord's chip and the Lord's test. And the only ones that are going to pass this test was ultimately chosen by the Lord to pass this test is the elect of Israel, which we hope to hell, Lord willing, that we're part of. Because this ain't going to be no easy test. The Lord is going to put us through the ringer, meaning the Lord is going to put us, in uncomfortable situation. We're going to be put to the test, The Lord is going to, make it known who are His chosen, This test ain't going to be easy. A test is not really meant to be easy. It's meant to be hard, But the beautiful thing is the Lord's hopeful elect have been revising, have been rooted in Yahweh Shai. Lord willing that we endure, because when this test happens, if you've been rooted in Yahweh Shai, your faith is going to be strong, There's even going to be brothers that get their heads chopped off for the Lord. Some of us could be those brothers. Lord willing, we're part of the Lord's elect. Some of us are going to die for the Lord. This ain't going to be no easy ride. We're going to be put in uncomfortable situation, And food is going to be a major motivator for people to take this chip, Because at the end of the day, Esau is going to make it mandatory. First, he's going to do it voluntary, but ultimately, he's going to make it mandatory through the laws from the governments. And ultimately, if you're not, having this device in you, you're not going to be able to operate in a society. So this is ultimately going to be, you're ultimately going to be forced or squeezed into it. You're going to have to either take this chip, basically, to live on Earth. You're not going to be able to buy or sell. You're not going to be able to rent an apartment. Get groceries from the grocery store. You're not going to be able to do, the things in society that you do now, without, having it. It's going to replace ultimately your bank card or your debit card. It's going to replace your phone, because people ultimately now, through gradualism, people have stopped using cash and ultimately are now using their phone, the chip in their phone to pay for things, or their Apple Watch. These are gradualism ultimately leading to people being, convenient and ultimately upgrading to the chip inside you. And that's what's coming, and that's what the mark of the beast is the microchip that's going to be placed inside you, either in your hand or ultimately in your forehead, and most people, are going to take it. It's not going to be, everyone not taking it. A lot of people are going to take it, man. This test Ultimately the elect is going to pass this test. The vast majority of our people are going to take it. Jake loved to eat. You know, Jake, a lot of our people have no morals, man. Have no integrity for Yahweh Shemashai. That's why the scripture says in the book of Luke that when the Son of Man come, shall he find faith? Because the only ones that are going to have the faith is a very few Israelites. And that's who's going to be protected in the time, of the MOTB, which we're in that time, and ultimately when it becomes mandatory, through the, legislations, and ultimately you ain't going to be able to operate in Esau society without it, and that's when it's going to be known who's down for the Lord, when push comes to shove, are you for Yahweh Shemashai? Because it's all good talking, saying that you love the Lord and his son, and you want to strive for righteousness, you want to, be of the Lord's elect. But the Lord's going to test us, every single one of us. We're going to be put through the test, and this MOTB is going to cause a huge division, man. And the Lord said he's going to do division, especially among family members. It's going to be a major test, brothers and sisters. There's a reason why Yahweh Shemashai has his men, his prophets constantly warning about it. We're on the verge of this prophecy, coming to pass. The system's already here. The talks of digital IDs being made, mandated, is here. The CBDC being piloted everywhere, is here. The digital, system is here. They just need that crisis, and they just need, army to legislate, people having it inside them, the device, the chip, the charagma is going to be inserted inside you. It's going to be incisioned, and it's going to be the highest form of idolatry, man, because ultimately you're taking a blood covenant with Esau. You're basically saying Esau is your power. So if you take it, you become an abomination in the sight of Yahweh Shemashai. And you know what happens to an abomination? An abomination gets destroyed, So the Lord's going to destroy you if you take it, and we know that for a fact. It's in the scriptures. Those that take it are going to get judged horribly, People are going to be getting cancerous sores, ultimately dying in that nuclear destruction, man, and the judgment that's coming, and ultimately having a bad legacy, because you're going to be tied to that. You do not want to be tied to those Jakes that took the MOTB, It's going to be very, very serious very soon, Bear with me 1 second. Yeah, this is going to be very serious, man. It's going to affect every single one of us, and everyone in society is going to affect, This is a central warning from Yahweh Shemashai. The MOTB is going to be literal, It's going to be literally a physical device, a microchip inside of you. It's not sin or sleeping with white women or Christianity. It's about control of buying and selling, and ultimately total control. Because Esau, the elites, they have a God complex. They want to be like the Most High, and no one can ever be like the Most High. It's just that they're deluded, because Yahweh Shemashai has put upon them strong delusion. So they think that in their new world order that they can rule the earth with a small population of people as gods, and live forever. That's the, wet dream of Esau Edom. But the Lord is not going to let them have that. He's only going to let them microchip people and put a lot of people to death. And ultimately, Yahushua is going to turn up. So Esau's going to lose. The elites are going to lose. And our people that do take this chip, you're going to lose on this side. Because at the end of the day, all Israel will be all right in the kingdom. But only right now, the only ones that are going to be all right, are not going to take this chip, is the elect. The Lord's going to protect them in the hour of temptation. So the elect are not going to take this device. Even though Yahweh Shemashai is going to put us to the test, Lord willing, we're part of the Lord's elect. But the elect are going to be kept safe from this device, because it's going to be very tempting, man. Because Esau's going to come with lying wonders and miracles, man. And you already see how stunning AI is, how deceptive it is, and how much of a miracle it's starting to look, because this devil has, the Heavenly Father's left-hand side ain't no joke, man, So ultimately, this devil, he's been given, power on the left-hand side to bring forth this, digital infrastructure, and ultimately this device, man. And he's gonna come with smooth, talk, and ultimately talk of salvation through this chip. That lying wonders and miracles. This can heal your sight. This can heal if you're deaf, this can make you hear. So this devil's gonna come with all of it. We're meant to be rooted in Yahweh Shai, man. Because Yahweh Shai is coming with the healing. To hell with this devil. This devil is not Yahweh Shai. This devil is a fraud. He's just a creature that's just been blessed on the left-hand side for a certain time, as the wicked, and ultimately their blessing is really a curse, But Esau, Edom, he's just a man. He's a base man that was being given power by Yahweh Shai because the earth has been given to the hand of the wicked. If you take that device, you're basically submitting to a base man. You're submitting to Esau, Edom. You chose Esau over Yahweh Shai. And as an Israelite, that's a horrible legacy, man. So don't take the chip, man. May Yahweh Shai keep you away from the chip, as well as myself. Lord willing, us die in Yahweh Shai. Because it's going to be very tempting. And ultimately, food is going to be a major motivator for people to take it, because you're not going to be able to buy or sell. You're not going to be able to go to your Walmart, Tesco, Asda, wherever supermarket you're near your neighborhood or where you at. You ain't going to be able to get food without this device. To be able to operate in Esau society, to get your wages and your job, you're going to need this device. It's going to be integral for you to have this device to operate in Esau society. This microchip, which is the MOTB. And if you take it, you're cooked. And remember that that the Lord ultimately is the one that provides. Who do you think gives the birds food? The birds don't go to no supermarket. Yahweh Shai feeds them. So how much more us, his people, man? Particularly might be of his elect, Lord willing, we enjoy. The Lord ain't gonna let his elect starve. He's gonna feed his elect. His men are gonna be fed, and the women are gonna be joined to the men. The women that Yahweh Shai is gonna have mercy on. The remnant sisters, they're gonna be joined onto the men of the Lord, who are gonna be made gold in the time that's coming. In the time when the MOTB is gonna go global. In the peak part of Jacob's trouble. So the Lord's elect are gonna be taken care of, man. And I'm gonna prove that. I think it's in the book of Isaiah. Bear with me. Yeah, I found it. This is Isaiah 65, verse 13. Therefore, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai. Behold, my servants, which are the elect men of Israel, the prophets of Yahweh Ba'ashem Shai, the men that stood there, out there in the highways and the byways, stood swiftly for the name of Yahweh Ba'ashem Shai, are going to be rewarded. The Lord is going to have them eat in the time of Jacob's trouble. And ultimately, the rest of the believers are going to be around the prophets, because Yahweh Shai is the ultimate, matchmaker, especially for the women. They're going to be, the sisters that are part of the remnant. They're going to be, ultimately drawn to the men of Yahweh Shai. Isaiah 4:1 is going to take place, and the only ones that are going to get accepted are the women that the Lord's going to have mercy on. Particularly the remnant sisters, who are going to be joined onto the men of Yahweh Shai, because their salvation is through a man of Yahweh Shai, because the Lord ultimately deals with order. The women's access to Yahweh Shai, to Yahweh Shai, is through the man. Our access to Yahweh Shai is through Yahweh Shai. There's an order. So the men of the Lord are going to be, protected and given food. And ultimately it extends down to their household, because the Lord, Yahweh Shai, is merciful. The Lord, saved Noah and his household, because why? Because Noah was a man of the Lord, and the Lord had mercy on his household. So the Lord's going to have mercy on his servants and their household, man. And ultimately the elect are going to be taken care of, in this time of our temptation, because the elect are not going to be starving in that time. Esau's gonna bring this, famine, and also the, not be able to buy or sell because you don't have the chip. That's gonna play a part in people that that don't take it. They're gonna have to find another food source. But guess what? The elect ultimately are going to get food from the Supreme Being, Yahweh Shemashai, the one that created food. You know, it's going to be miraculous, man. Remember, the Lord's going to have Michael, man, stand for the elect, man. The great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people that are written in the book of life, which is the elect of Israel. So the Lord's going to feed his servants, man. But ye shall be hungry. Speaking of the 2/3 and the wicked rebellious jakes, they're going to be hungry. And they're most likely going to take the chip, because famine is terrible. Dying of starvation is terrible. You'd rather get put down by the sword than die of starvation, man. And that's in the scriptures. It's better to, die of the sword than, die of famine. Behold, my servant shall drink, and ye shall be thirsty. Behold, my servant shall rejoice, but ye shall be ashamed. Behold, my servant shall sing for joy of heart. The men of the Yahweh Shemashai are going to be very happy, and we can even picture that ourselves being happy in that time. Lord willing, we enjoy, as servants of the Lord, because the men of the Lord are going to be very happy when this happens, because that's what we've been prophesying, man, through the spirit power of Yahweh Shemashai, the end of this society, the end of this world. And the MOTB is going to bring us closer to the return of Yahweh Shai, because this has to happen before Yahweh Shai returns. The Most High's prophecies work in order. There's no confusion with the Lord's prophecies. They come in order. The MOTB is going to be here, made mandatory before Yahweh Shai returns. And that's going to be a step very close to Yahweh Shai's return. Because once this chip happens, ultimately that's when, Yahweh Shai is going to ultimately return at the peak part of World War III. Because World War III, is ultimately going to happen too, And things are going to happen fast, like apostles always go into, man, So the Lord's ultimately going to speed up the days, and he has been speeding up the days. If you've been circumspect, you will know that Yahweh Shemashai, is making time go fast, and the body Yahweh Shemashai, so the sooner time goes fast, the sooner, these prophecies happen, and the sooner Yahweh Shai returns in salvation, for the Lord's elect. Lord willing, we're part of that, and the kingdom of heaven being established, But ye shall cry for sorrow of heart, and ye shall howl for vexation of spirits. So the 2/3 and the rebellious Israelites, they're going to be, lamenting. They're going to be, stuck out here. And ultimately, they're going to line up for that chip, and get toasted, So when this MOTB, is made mandatory, the elect are going to lean on the Lord, man. Even though the Lord might, put us through, because he is going to do that. The Lord's going to put us to the test, The Lord might have us go a couple of days without food. And there's a reason why the Lord put the Spirit on us to start fasting, so we can be built for that time. Where the Lord is going to put us through the test. And ultimately, the Lord's going to reward his servants, like we just read. The Lord is not going to leave his servants hanging. So Esau's not the only way you can get food, because right now people have been accustomed to grocery stores and Esau's, delivery trucks bringing food to the stores and you getting it from the store. People, have become accustomed to that. That's not the only way to get food, man. The Most High, there's nothing impossible with Yahweh Shemashai. And the Lord's going to do miracles for his elect, So the elect are going to be taken care of, man. Just believe that. I believe, So fuck this devil, man. He doesn't have, he didn't create food. He didn't create, existence. He didn't create, life. Even though he wants to be like the Most High, he can never be like the Most High. No one can ever be on Yahweh's on the Most High Yahweh's level. The Most High Yahweh Bashem Yahushai created food. If the Lord feeds the birds, how much more his people that are of the elect? Remember that, man. So the Lord's gonna come through like he always does. In famine and in that chip rollout, the elect will be provided for by Yahweh Shemashai, while the rest of our people who trust Esau are gonna be left starving, and ultimately they're gonna take that chip for their destruction. And I'm gonna read about the destruction for those that take it in Revelation 14. Revelation 14, verse 9 to 10. And it says here, doom for the worshippers of the beast. You're doomed if you worship Esau and his sister, man. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast, Esau's sister, the beast is NATO and the EU, The Roman Empire revived, the second leg of the Roman Empire, you know, and his image is really the system, but the beast is the NATO and the EU, Esau's, revival of the Roman Empire, like Elder Ariella always goes into, iPhone, Rome with an iPhone, I'm just poking fun, but guess what, if you worship Esau's, Western world, his beast, his system, and he receive his mark, which is the microchip, in your forehead or in your hand, what the scriptures say here, the same shall drink of the wine or the wrath of Yahweh Shemashai. You're going to receive the Lord's judgment, you're going to receive the Lord's terrible and severe wrath, and you do not want to receive that, and ultimately, if you're not of the elect, and if your portion is to be a 2/3 and a rebellious Israelite, and normally take the chip, that means the Lord destined you to receive his wrath, and that's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living power. That's why we try our best to strive for righteousness and hope in Yahweh Shemashai's mercy, hope that we're part of the Lord's elect, who are going to be kept safe in that time, and ultimately, who are going to lean onto the Lord, because the vast majority of our people are going to get the wrath of the Lord, because they're going to do things that are not pleasing unto the Lord, i.e. be rebellious, rejecting, Yahweh Shemashai's, mercy, and ultimately taking that chip and getting destroyed, which shall be poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone, the destruction, and the holy angels, in the presence of the holy angels, and in the presence of the Lamb. And that shows you that, the MOTB comes first, before Yahweh Shai's return, because the people that took it are going to be destroyed in the presence of Yahweh Shai and the angels, so the MOTB is going to be happening before the destruction, the test has to happen before the ultimate destruction and the climax and the start of the kingdom of heaven, so anyone who takes this chip is finished, man. Any Jake that takes it, there's no mercy for you, the Lord's wrath, the nuclear destruction, Yahweh Shai and the angels zapping people by the laser beams, and there's no, getting out of that, so there's no repentance if you take this. So remember, don't take the chip, no matter how, uncomfortable, you get put in a situation that's so uncomfortable, your wife might be want to be, tempted to take it. You meant to, stand your ground, man, as an Israelite man, of course, because you're the head of the household, and ultimately, if your household ain't with you, that's on them, you gotta be for the Lord, man. So don't take it, man, and also for the sister too, don't take that chip, because Yahweh Shemashai is gonna provide for his elect. The Lord provides for the birds, how much more the Israelites also of his elect, his people that are of his elect. Remember that, brothers and sisters, man. And I remember that for myself too, man. The Lord is going to provide, man. The Lord has a proven track record. Look what he did for our forefathers of old, man. Yahweh Shemashai came through, and he's going to do that again. So yeah, all praises to Yahweh, Washem Yahweh Shai, Washem Rakakodash. Double honors to my apostles, the elders, great millstone. Shalom to my brothers and sisters, listen and learning.